Hey, good morning, everyone. Nice to be here, and I'm glad you guys are joining. Today, we're going to go over a little bit of a history of how we got to be where we're at from a regulatory standpoint with Nerc, and the regional entities. And then later this afternoon, we'll dovetail in, or this morning, we'll dovetail into overview of the generator owner and generator operator requirements. And then later this afternoon, doing a little bit deeper dive on the SIP low impact requirements specifically as they apply to generator owners and operators as well. So first is very high level, go over what the grid here in North America looks like, and then talk about the regulatory construct and where power derives from DOE down to FERC and the differences between these different entities and their role in managing the reliability of the electric grid here in the US. And then take a little bit deeper dive into all of the different operating entities within the Nerc functional model, and then start to break down what the heck is a Nerc reliability standard. And then that'll be where we stop before going into a deeper dive for GO and GOP requirements later this morning. If you do have questions, I think Sarah said, feel free to ask throughout. We'll do our best to keep this interactive and informal. I would prefer not to just talk at everyone for an hour if possible. So please don't hesitate to ask questions. Just real quick, kind of how I got here. I started as an intern in an EPC, American Capital Energy, and then started as an intern at GridSecurity 10 years ago, actually. And then quickly started getting into the Nerc regulatory consulting roles, working with larger traditional utilities at that time, consulting on their SIP medium and high impact programs, as well as their operations and planning programs. And then was promoted to CEO of GridSecurity, but 2 years ago we spun out our cybersecurity business, GridSecurity, and so I shifted over to CEO with that entity. All right, so this power grid we have, we'll talk about how it's interconnected, how it's not, and how we got to this hodgepodge of transmission. So we'll be primarily focused on the bulk power system or the bulk electric system, somewhat interchangeable terms. We'll break those down in a little while. But as you can see from this map here, as most things in human history evolve, right, it starts to address one need and kind of builds and snowballs from there. So in the early days, we started building small generators near the cities that were emerging. And as population expanded, we had to build transmission out to those new population areas. So on the left, you see what the transmission system in the United States looks like today. And on the right, you see just an example of population density. You'll see that the density of transmission closely matches where we have population density, or AKA load centers, because to date, we've been building generation near load centers, right? Centralized generation, combined cycle plants, coal plants, et cetera, to serve the local load. But quickly in the early days of the electric AC system, we realized that it was better to interconnect with our neighbors to kind of share that load, literally and figuratively. So that's how the transmission system emerged. As we're going through an energy transition today, we're building renewables and inverter-based resources, out in the desert, in the middle of nowhere. So, big topic of a discussion, we won't get into it too much today, is, building new transmission, right? Because now we don't have generation co-located right next to our load centers and our population centers, but rather out in rural areas. So the generation's happening in these rural areas, but the load isn't there for that generation of power. So we need to get it to the load centers. In California, from a transmission system, essentially all roads lead to Southern California, LA, and you can see that on our high voltage system on the map on the left. So I think everyone's aware we have an interconnected system, and we have the Eastern, Western, and ERCOT or Texas interconnection, as well as the Quebec interconnection, and then some pockets up in Alaska. Each of these different interconnections are separate AC synchronous machines, and they are not connected from an AC standpoint to each other. So what this means is that, what happens in Seattle can affect the system down in LA, right, or anywhere else in the Western interconnection, because it is one big synchronous machine. However, what happens in LA on the grid, cannot directly affect New York because they are not AC intertied. So when we start talking a little bit later this afternoon about the critical infrastructure protection or CIP standards and how those requirements are applied to different entities, a lot of people are aware of this magical 1500 megawatt threshold rating, and that 1500 megawatts from a control center standpoint is with 1500 megawatts in a single interconnection. Big I interconnection as defined by Nerc. So that's that Western interconnection versus Eastern versus Texas. And that's because when we're looking at the system from a reliability standpoint, again, what happens in the Western interconnection cannot directly affect the Eastern interconnection. So they are separate systems. But they're not entirely disconnected. So we do have DC interties between the different AC interconnections. These DC interties are used for like emergency power transfer, but because it goes from AC to DC, again, frequency and other events that may happen on the system, do not have reliability impacts in the other interconnections. We won't get too much further in the weeds, though, from a DC standpoint today. All right, so now let's transition to our regulatory structure and the differences between FERC, Nerc, and the regional entities that carry out enforcement. So FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It is a governmental body. It derives its power from the Department of Energy. And it oversees all interstate transmission of electricity, natural gas, and oil. Interstate being the key word there. So really, we're focused on the transmission system or the bulk power system, and that is where FERC has jurisdiction. At a local level, we also have the distribution system, right? However, FERC does not have jurisdiction and oversight over a distribution system. That's where there are state public and local public utilities commissions that oversee and regulate the distribution system. So again, today we'll really be focused primarily just on the bulk power system or the transmission side of the house, where FERC has authority and jurisdiction. We'll talk a little bit more today throughout in different capacities about how, Texas is Texas, so it's a little different. So FERC does not regulate the ERCOT wholesale electric market either. FERC's role from a reliability standard perspective is that it directs Nerc as the electric reliability organization to address reliability risks through the standards development process. So Nerc, also known as the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, is actually a not-for-profit corporation. It looks and smells like the government in many capacities, but it is not technically a government entity, which is, the C here is corporation versus the C in FERC is commission. So Nerc's job is to address risks and directives from FERC, and then work with the industry to develop reliability standards to manage and mitigate those risks. They have responsibility for monitoring, short and long-term planning on the grid as well. They provide certifications and training to industry personnel in certain capacities. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then really just keeping an eye on industry trends and issues. A big one right now that we'll get into a little bit more later this afternoon is obviously the explosion of inverter-based resources. So lots of changes, happening right now at the Nerc level to address this new technology that is coming on at scale on the grid today. And they are also allowed to audit entities, and they do carry out audits of entities, but we'll talk about the regional entities that support Nerc in enforcement and auditing in more detail shortly. So we talked about the bulk power system, bulk electric system. So this is defined as 100 kV or higher. And again, does not include facilities that are associated with the distribution system. That's where the state commissions have authority and regulation. So how did we get here? As with most things in life, we identified and experienced real events that were caused by unmanaged, unmitigated risks on the bulk power system. And then we have a knee-jerk reaction to go and start to address those risks, through compliance requirements or other means. So throughout the history of the electric grid, there's been many events that have shaped and formed the regulatory framework that we have today. We won't go over all of these, but it's important to note that originally Nerc started as a voluntary kind of industry group for utilities. Where they shared best practices and kind of blue ribbon panel type stuff, but nothing was mandatory or enforceable. Fast forward to the major Northeast blackout in 2003, and where basically all of New York and a lot of the Northeast was without power for, in some areas, up to 3 days. And that is really what drove the transition from a voluntary Nerc framework to a mandatory reliability standards and requirements framework that we know today. So again, we could go, we don't have enough time today. There's a lot of great stories about some of these outages and what transpired from them. In the Northeast blackout in 2003, a tree hit a line in Ohio. As many events typically start from a vegetation management standpoint. And then there were some exacerbating factors like incorrect alarming and monitoring from some of the utilities in that region that then led to the cascading outage that impacted 50 million customers, New York City included. And again, in some areas, power was out for 3 days. I'm actually from New York, so I remember that growing up. And yeah, the Amtrak train system, everything was out for multiple days. It was kind of a weird time. As a kid, it was kind of fun. The train stopped. We were able to walk the train tracks because usually they're busy. But obviously, it was a very major event that had severe economic impacts and damages, and hence then this transition to a mandatory reliability framework. So that was 2003. There was a lot of sausage making, at the government level between 2003 up until 2007, when the first versions of the Nerc reliability standards were actually put into enforcement and made mandatory. All right, so how does Nerc monitor compliance? I think everyone's aware there's an audit process. Since we'll be focusing mostly on generator owners and generator operators today throughout the day, it's important to know that the audit schedule for those types of entities is on a 6 to 9 year rolling cycle as we stand now. So while audits are obviously a major component of how Nerc enforces compliance with applicable standards, it's not really the way they do it, day to day, month to month, year to year, even for generator owners and generator operators. That's where different processes like self-certification step in. So there's an annual self-certification that registered entities need to submit. And then a big piece of the regulatory framework within Nerc is this concept of kind of self-policing and self-reporting. So there's an expectation that when entities identify a potential compliance issue or non-compliance with a applicable standard, that they actually self-report that and self-police themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about that process later, but it's a little different than some other mandatory compliance frameworks. So again, auditing is there, but it's not necessarily, especially for generator owners and generator operators, the main way in which compliance is monitored by Nerc or the regions. They're also able to issue spot checks, you know, if an issue is identified or there's a reason to. And then we don't need to talk about the rest of them, like preliminary screening or anything like that. Those are, you know, pretty infrequent and not typical. So the carrot and the stick. One thing that Nerc right away identified was they wanted to ensure that from a, you know, kind of a stick standpoint, there was enough teeth and weight behind the mandatory compliance requirements in the way that financial penalties can be assessed so that no entity could make a business decision to not do compliance, right? So what they want to avoid is, you know, an entity looking at these regulatory requirements saying, well, it's going to cost money to implement and manage these requirements. Why don't I just not do that and deal with paying the fine? To circumvent that, there are up to, I think it's $1.3 million now. They keep adjusting it for inflation, but that's $1.3 million per violation per day. I will, of course, say most people are aware that those types of fines are very, very actually probably never actually implemented at that level, but they are there at that threshold to ensure that we can't just as a business decide we're not going to do compliance and have that make financial sense. So where hefty fines do come into play is if your entity is involved in a blackout and was found to be negligent or non-compliant. So it's really when you have non-compliance plus a reliability event that we see hefty fines be levied. If you have a compliance event, non-compliance issue, you identify it yourself, you self-report it, and it didn't result in a reliability issue or major grid event, you're not going to see anywhere close to those types of financial penalties. And actually, typically, especially for generator owners, generator operators, there's going to be no financial penalty associated with that. It's going to be what they call a compliance exception, kind of like a fixed find and track, right? So you identified the issue, you self-reported it, and now you have to put in place a mitigation plan, to communicate to the regional entity and Nerc how you will ensure that that same type of compliance issue and potential reliability issue does not happen again. And as long as you're able to do that and demonstrate, you've fixed the gap in the program, you're probably just going to be monitored and no financial penalty. On the carrot side, there is a concept called internal compliance program, and that is actually not associated with any specific reliability standard, but is a well-known best practice that kind of is the umbrella over all your different programs, policies, and procedures to address other mandatory reliability standards. And really what this encompasses is kind of that culture of self-identifying gaps and potential non-compliance, self-reporting them, and having that whole framework and process in place to continually improve compliance. And we keep saying compliance, but I just really want to reiterate that the reason all these mandatory compliance standards and associated requirements are here is because they are addressing an actual risk that has already been realized on the grid, or risks that we know are present that we need to continually manage. So everything is about maintaining and upholding reliability of the bulk power system and bulk electric system operations. We'll talk a little bit later about the kind of market economic side of things, but primarily today, everything we talk about is in place to support the reliable operation of the power grid. We'll get into this in more detail in a little while, but what does this look like to go on the Nerc compliance journey? Again, we talked about an ICP. There's going to be a process that you need to implement to first develop your program prior to needing to register the facility, whether we're talking about a generator or a control center or some other facility on the bulk electric system. At that point, then you register. That's kind of day one, right? So we often say it's like getting married. You do all this work, planning for the wedding. Everyone's happy, get everything in place, you're ready to go, you get married, and now you're out of the honeymoon phase, right? So compliance definitely does not start after registration, just like it does not end after registration. So there's work that needs to be done before your facility is registered with Nerc to ensure that you are compliant on day one of your audit period. And then there's continual work that needs to occur to maintain compliance for the lifetime of that facility and its associated registration. All right, now we're diving into the Nerc functional model and kind of how FERC, Nerc, and these other regional entities are related. So we talked about FERC and that it's associated with the DOE, derived its power, the Energy Policy Act, and then in 2006, again, a few years after the major Northeast blackout, as everyone was starting to talk about the need for mandatory reliability standards, Nerc was appointed as the Electric Reliability Organization by FERC. Then Nerc established their compliance monitoring enforcement program and regional entities. So there's WEC in the Western Interconnection, as well as 5 others now. So this is a map showing not from an engineering or power system operation standpoint how the country is broken up, but how the country is broken up from a regulatory and compliance and enforcement standpoint. So these regional entities, they work directly with Nerc to carry out the auditing, monitoring, and enforcement actions within these different regions. So it used to be, of course, with traditional vertically integrated utilities that for the most part, their territory and their footprint, fell within a certain region. And, normally you only had to deal with 1, maybe 2 different regional entities. But with the advent, deregulation, independent power producers, and especially now inverter-based resources, a lot of our clients and asset owners, they have facilities all throughout the country and and then because of that, within the footprints of different regional entities, which means that, when it comes time for audit or where there's regional variances, there's different things to look out for in different regions. I'd say probably 90% of compliance, Nerc compliance is the same throughout the country, but again, there are these regional variances, and we'll talk about a few of them in a little while. Okay, so now that we're getting below the regional entities, that's kind of the line of where the regulatory authority and enforcement stops, and now we're getting into the actual entities and functional types that carry out operations on the bulk power system. So at the top of that food chain is the reliability coordinator, also known as the RC. So here's yet another map showing how the breakout of different reliability coordinators within the country. So think about them kind of as the traffic cops. They're not typically actually making operating decisions on a day-to-day basis. However, they are monitoring real-time operations and looking out for the macro scale of the grid. So throughout their territory and working in tandem with other RCs and their interconnection, ensuring that we are, we don't have any issues with resource adequacy or major macro issues that need to be addressed. So very high level, they're not, typically moving generation up or down or anything like that. We'll talk about those entities that do that here in a minute. They do have the authority to do so if they need to step in to avoid a major reliability issue, however. But hopefully that doesn't happen often, and that you as a generator owner, generator operator, probably never hear directly from your RC, and that's a good thing. Next in line underneath the reliability coordinating function is the balancing authority. So as the name implies, the balancing authority's job in life is to balance generation and load. One of the primary metrics and ways in which we measure the balance of generation and demand is system frequency. So we operate a 60 hertz system, and the balancing authority has a responsibility for maintaining frequency as close to 60 hertz as possible. And the error, the deviation for error is very, very tight on frequency. And so they're looking at what's called area control error and other metrics continuously to make sure that we are not falling out of balance. So some people don't realize, probably most people in the industry realize, but the general public doesn't always realize that essentially today, with the exception of utility scale storage that's starting to come online, we are generating exactly as much electricity as we are using in a given second. And that's what the balancing authority in the different areas are doing. An area control error is the balancing authorities looking between their area and the neighboring areas to make sure flows are balanced and we're not importing, exporting, too much, and we're keeping the system overall balanced and operating at 60 hertz. Next up is the transmission operator. So transmission operator is working very closely with the balancing authority. Oftentimes, they are the same entity, just serving multiple functions. They're managing outages of transmission lines. They're looking at congestion, and they're making sure the transmission system is operating within defined system operating limits, or what's called IRLs as well. And they also have a responsibility for doing planning and analysis, just like the RC and BAs have that same responsibility, but in different functions. This map, I will say though, isn't quite a map of transmission operators. That map's hard to find. This maps are actually of RTOs and ISOs. But again, because in many cases, the ISO RTO is actually the same entity as the TOP or transmission operator. So ISOs, RTOs, independent system operator versus regional transmission operator. What's the difference? They're pretty much synonymous terms, but this is where we get into the wholesale market versus reliability function. So when deregulation happened, we realized we needed these regional independent system operators to accommodate and open up transmission for independent power producers. So on the charts on the right are primarily showing the wholesale market function. These are from actually CAISO's website just this morning that I pulled down, showing how we're forecasting load versus generation. And they do that in a day ahead market. They do it in a 1 hour market, a 15-minute market, a 5-minute market, and then it gets down into what's called AGC, automated generator control, where we're managing and moving up and down generation within 4-second increments. So obviously, as the time horizons get shorter, the amount of error that is accepted from the forecast versus actual starts to get tighter and tighter. And they're using different functions to make sure that we are generating exactly as much electricity as we are consuming throughout the day. We won't get deep into resource adequacy, but there's a whole ancillary services market that is not a market to provide real power, but rather to provide supporting services such as resource adequacy, which is making sure that we have additional generation sitting there ready to be called upon in case we have an event, in case we blow the forecast and we actually have a lot more demand, today than we thought we did, or in case we have an unplanned outage of a major generator. We have other generators and other resources kind of sitting on standby to step in, and the ISO will call upon those. Major point here is that we always try to solve the equation for balancing generation with demand through economic means, first and foremost. So it's called economic dispatch. So generators will bid into the market. They will say, hey, I have X amount of megawatts available at X price per megawatt hour. And CAISO and other ISOs and RTOs will, through that economic dispatch process, they will literally start stacking bids from cheapest to most expensive. Keep going down the list as prices get more and more expensive until we can solve the equation. If we can't, though, the important piece here is that while we try to run the system through the most efficient economic means on the market side, first and foremost, if we cannot, that's when the reliability side of the house steps in. So again, California ISO, like most of these others shown on the map, they are serving both a market function as well as a Nerc registered entity function. So our California ISO became a reliability coordinator a few years ago. They're a balancing authority. They're also a transmission operator. But punchline being, if we cannot solve it through the wholesale market, they will step in on the reliability side, and reliability trumps economic wholesale market when needed.
Hey, John, we have a question. On this map, why are portions of it white or blank?
Because there's no true single independent system operator or RTO there. There's not as much deregulation, and there's still more vertically integrated. So those are more vertically integrated utilities operating their own transmission, generation, et cetera. Next up in the food chain is the generator operator. So generator operators' goal in life is to essentially listen and support the other reliability entities above it. On the economic side, the generator operator's goal in life is to produce as many electrons for the generator owner as possible, so that the asset makes as much money as possible. But in terms of the Nerc functional model, generator operators are responsible for providing data up to the transmission operators, balancing authorities, et cetera. And then when called upon or issued what's called an operating instruction, we'll get into that further as we do a deep dive into reliability standards later this morning. The generator operator has to respond and comply with those operating instructions. So essentially, operate your generator. If you have a change in status, you got to let the other entities know. And if they tell you that you have to change your status through an operating instruction, that is what you must do. So, with that, scheduling planned outages, communicating unplanned outages, et cetera, et cetera. So just as a quick summary overview, again, the RC have the macro level view and overall responsibility for maintaining reliability within their territory. Underneath them, the BA or balancing authority's main job in life is to balance generation and demand, supply and demand, as well as coordinate imports and exports with other balancing authority regions. The TOP's responsibility primarily is to maintain voltage. And the GOP's main responsibility is to, again, operate their facilities and provide data upstream and respond to operating instructions coming to them from BAs or TOPs. From a generator owner standpoint, well, as we'll get into it later this morning, there are a lot of Nerc compliance requirements that a generator owner needs to implement and maintain. You know, the owner side of the equation don't really have a day-to-day real-time operating function. But from a planning, a documentation of the facility, we'll get into the facility, FAC 8 facility ratings and the most limiting element. Those are and also how you configure your protection system settings. Those are all responsibilities of the generator owner. But just like a transmission owner, generator owners don't really participate in day-to-day real-time operations. That is where the generator operator comes in. And just as a quick comparison here, again, owners more on establishing the capabilities and documentation for the facility versus operators monitoring the status of the facility. How is that facility performing today, and communicating, changes in status upstream to TOPs and BAs. So I started to touch on this a little bit earlier, but it's important to in terms of how the audit cycle and schedule for GOs and GOPs, it has been pushed out to a 6 to 9 year cycle in the last few years. The graph we're showing here is from Nerc and a summary of the number of registered entities that are fulfilling these different reliability functions. And not surprisingly, since deregulation, number of IPPs, et cetera, the number of generator owners and associated generator operators, is by and far the largest functional entity type we have registered with Nerc. And that number is continuing to climb very, very quickly with the advent of inverter-based resources. Probably don't need to explain most of this group, but yeah, the number of Nerc registered IBRs has already increased exponentially the last few years. And as we'll talk about here in a second and do a deeper dive late this afternoon, that number is going to do a step change yet again as the Nerc registration threshold is lowered for IBRs. So kind of punchline here is that IBRs in many capacities have kind of started to break the regulatory boxes we have previously drawn from FERC and Nerc. I don't think they envisioned having this huge of a number of registered entities that they have to monitor and enforce. And so for better or for worse, we'll see how it plays out after the IBR threshold's lowered and we have even more registered and new plants being built. But the regional entities are struggling to find the staffing, the budget, all of that to be able to effectively monitor and enforce this number of registered entities in the GO and GOP registration type. So let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into how does Nerc registration get triggered today for inverter-based resources, because it actually happens not through the primary definition of the bulk electric system that we covered earlier, but actually through an inclusion 4 to be specific. So the way it's laid out today is whether we're talking wind, solar, or battery storage, any inverter-based resource, if its nameplate is 75 MVA or greater, prior to the point of interconnection or change of ownership where it interconnects with the off-taking utility. That meets the criteria under inclusion I-4, and thus that facility needs to register with Nerc. And again, we'll get into the whole registration process in more detail later. But right now, that's where it sits. And as I alluded to, and I'm sure many are already aware, that is in the process of changing. So for non-inverter based resources, aka traditional generation like combined cycle or coal power plants, et cetera, they currently have to register with Nerc at 20 MVA or greater. So it was kind of a little carve out, having IBRs only register at 75 MVA or greater. But that is changing. And so with the number of IBRs that are currently on the system and more of them coming along, FERC identified this risk and issued a directive to Nerc to go address it. And so that process is underway as we speak. What we do know today is that the registration threshold for IBRs will be going down to 20 MVA, and that registration, and that's going to apply to all existing inverter-based resources as well as new ones go forward. So no grandfathering in. That's probably the most impactful part of this change, because there's obviously a lot of existing facilities out there that are sub 75 MVA nameplate that currently do not have to have a Nerc compliance program and meet all the requirements of a generator owner or generator operator. But come 2026, that is going to change.
Hey, John, we got one question. Do large generators that sit behind the meter need to register with Nerc or FERC?
No, because behind the meter, you're I don't know what you mean by large, but assuming that you're actually on the distribution system and do not meet the orange highlighted criteria on the slide right now, no, that's, Nerc, FERC and Nerc, again, have no jurisdiction over the distribution system, only on the bulk electric system / bulk power system. So why are these changes needed? I think in summary, obviously, as more IBRs come online and they're providing more and more of our overall system capacity, they become more and more critical for supporting reliability. A single solar facility, just like a single combined cycle facility, by itself usually doesn't pose a major reliability impact. However, when you're looking at the aggregate, there is major reliability implications with the amount of IBRs we have on the grid today, and that's only going up. Another reason is that, again, the IBR, the technology type is different. And we found that whether it's unregistered IBRs or even currently Nerc registered IBRs and that are quote unquote complying with the existing Nerc reliability standards, we are and have seen and continue to see real reliability issues that are caused by inverter-based facilities. So far, the vast majority of these grid disturbances and events and reliability issues have to do with how the inverters are either riding through or not riding through system frequency and voltage excursions. So a lot of focus, and we'll get into it more later this morning, but a lot of focus on the PRC 24 standard that's being rewritten to better address the IBR technology, but really making sure that our inverter-based facilities are supporting and hopefully even improving the reliability of the system, because as you'll see from what's on the slide here, there's been a handful of events already where IBRs unfortunately degraded the overall reliability of the system. So that is what is currently being addressed. That's the risk currently being addressed by FERC and Nerc.
Hey, John, we got another question. Is the threshold based on nameplate or the actual power output from the facility?
From a NERC registration standpoint and everything we've talked about thus far, it is nameplate. So for example, even if you have a deliverability limit in your PPA and your controller, main power plant controller is limiting output below 75 MVA, if the nameplate of your inverters, and sorry, I should have said this earlier, but when we're talking about megawatts or MVAs as it relates to NERC, we are always talking about the AC side of the system, not the DC side. But if the AC nameplate is, today 75 MVA or greater, that triggers registration, and by 2026, that will be moving down to 20 MVA. So it does not take into account, contractual limitations of deliverability or anything else. It is strictly nameplate for the purposes of registration. When we get into the deeper dive on SIP this afternoon, for better or for worse, that's where power output actually is the trigger for that 1500 megawatt threshold and not nameplate. So it does get a little confusing because depending on which side you're looking at, you have to look at both nameplate and actual power output.
Great, thanks, John. And also for everyone participating, we do have a What's New in NERC session this afternoon, and we'll do a deeper dive into the new GEO-IVR requirements as well as some additional changes to standards that are coming.
All right, now let's get to the most riveting section of the whole entire day. And we are going to go through the different aspects that constitute every single NERC reliability standard. So every standard, you can find all these standards all on NERC's website. They will look like what's on the screen. So using VAR2 as an example, but that's not the important piece. So there'll be a title, there'll be that fun compliance number designator, the VAR2. The VAR is the family of standard. The -002 in this case is the standard number within that family. And then the -4.1 in this case is the version of that standard. You will then have a purpose for each standard, which is, a few sentence explanation of why is this in effect. Usually talks at a very high level about the risk that we are trying to manage or mitigate with this standard. And then we'll get into section 4, which is the applicability. So for all the operations and planning standards, think about it, every NERC reliability standard with the exception of the SIP standards, the applicability is determined based on your functional entity type, your registration type. So see here, VAR2 is applicable to both generator operators and generator owners. On the SIP side, again, we'll get into it in more detail a little bit later. SIP is applicable to every single registered entity type, but then applicability is determined within the different requirements and standards, whether or not you're determined to be low, medium, or high impact under the SIP 2 evaluation criteria. Section 5 here is the effective dates. They always say see implementation plan. I hate to say it, but you need an abacus and a PhD degree to, sometimes figure out the exact date, because it has to do with, 60 days after it's posted in the federal registrar, et cetera. But NERC does finally in the last few years, easy lookup table now of what version of a standard is currently in enforcement, in effect, and then also when does the next version of this standard go into enforcement as well. So you won't find those dates directly within the, the PDF, the official PDF for the standard itself, but that information is available on NERC's website. Then we get into section B, and this is really the meat of every standard. This is where the requirements are laid out. So R1, requirement 1, and provides, the what needs to happen for these the different entities. So you'll see too, R1 is applicable to the generator operator. As you go through the rest of the standard, we won't do it in this example, but then R2 may be applicable to the generator owner, so on and so forth. Measure, the M or measure, is provided by Nerc to provide a description and example of what evidence, sufficient evidence, looks like to demonstrate compliance with the associated requirement. So it's kind of the answers to the test in some way. Obviously, not all the measures are all that helpful in actually determining how do you, from an operational standpoint, demonstrate compliance with the requirement. But they are always valuable to look at to get a better understanding of what Nerc and the regional entities are expecting to see from a documentation and evidentiary standpoint, so that you can demonstrate compliance with an applicable requirement, either during audit or during a self-certification, et cetera. Section C, to be honest, it's usually pretty useless. Don't need to spend much time here. Most of them pretty much say all the same thing, just kind of legalese language. You know, they do talk about evidence retention. You know, across the board, evidence needs to be maintained for 3 years. However, it gets a little weird now, especially since GOs and GOPs have moved out to a 6 to 9 year audit schedule, or cycle, I should say. And then also, in fact, you know, data storage isn't expensive anymore. So, you know, we always recommend that, you know, you're maintaining evidence in your repository throughout the registered life of the facility. You're not purging evidence, you know, after year 3. Beyond that, nothing interesting usually in the compliance section, you know, section C of a standard. It's all usually the same. They will also provide in each standard what's called violation severity levels. So you can see here for the different requirement, they'll kind of lay out, you know, what's a lower level violation severity level versus, you know, all the way up to severe. You know, obviously severe normally basically says you didn't do any of this, you didn't implement anything, something along those lines, versus the lower severity level is, you know, you missed a date, something like that, depending on what the requirement and standard is. This is sometimes a little useful to understand, you know, if you do have a compliance issue and you're going through the self-report process, like kind of where do I fall in the spectrum? But kind of like section C we just reviewed, I wouldn't spend much time normally on this section of reliability standard, you know, really focusing on the requirements and the measures as the primary meat of the standard. Guidelines and technical basis is also included for all standards, and this can be very helpful. It's kind of the longer-winded explanation of that short purpose statement in the introduction section of each standard. And they do their best to explain the reasoning of, you know, why this is here, and also some guidelines on, you know, how to interpret the words in the standard and how does that actually get applied. So definitely helpful to kind of look at alongside with the measures for each requirement to just better understand the intent behind why is this requirement here and what is my expectation, you know, as a registered entity associated with this requirement. Okay, so I touched on this a minute ago, but the 693 and that affectionate phrasing comes from FERC Order 693. So again, FERC will issue an order directive to Nerc to say, hey, we've identified this issue or this risk, go work with industry to do something about it. So the way the 693, or also known as the operations and planning standards, are applied is, again, based on registered entity type. So here's all the different family of standards within the O&P class. And an example of which one of these families is applicable to a GOP versus a GO. You obviously see there's overlap there, and then that overlap, then maybe Val 1 is applicable to a GO, et cetera. So there's multiple standards within each family, but here at the family level, you can see what's applicable to a GOP versus a GO. There are a lot of different requirements. Not all of them are always applicable. Some of them are applicable based on facility characteristics. So the standard overall is applicable to a GO, but in that applicability section that we reviewed a minute ago, there's a carve out saying, only for facilities that have disturbance monitoring equipment, or only for facilities that have a gen tie longer than a mile without clear line of sight. So there are some caveats, but you can see that the number of standard families and associated requirements is pretty numerous, along with the amount of words on standard pages is, somewhere around 2,000 pages of standards overall as we stand today. And then on the SIP side, I mentioned this earlier, but SIP is applicable to every registered entity type. But then applicability within this family of standards is divvied out based on low impact versus medium and high impact. Well, this afternoon, we'll be doing a deeper dive into primarily SIP low. We'll touch a little bit on medium and high impact SIP, but for the most part, SIP low. What I will say though is SIP low is a lot lighter touch than medium or high impact. The amount of requirements, and as you can see here, just even the standards, number of standards drastically increases as you move from low to medium impact. The additional work or level of rigor from medium to high is pretty incremental. Just a few additional requirements that high impact facilities have to do compared to medium impact, but that low to medium jump is a very, very large one. And that is it for the quick intro on Nerc. Any questions?
Great, thanks, John. All right, everybody, I have unmuted everyone, so you have the option to go ahead and unmute yourself. So if you have a question, go ahead and unmute and ask, or you can feel free to type that in. And if there are no questions, that's excellent. It means John did a fantastic job. And then again, some housekeeping items. This is recorded, so we will post this on our YouTube page next week. Tori is going to be sharing a survey. We'll also email this out later. We would greatly appreciate any feedback that you have regarding our presentation. And also, we have a few more webinars this afternoon and one more this morning in about 30 minutes related to GO/GOP, SIP low, like John said, and then what's new in Nerc later on this afternoon. If you are not registered for those and you would like to be, just let us know in chat right now. We'll get you that link to sign up. Great. Oh, there is a question. So Jake has a question. What is the difference between an RTO and an ISO?
They're functionally the same. You can more or less use those terms interchangeably.
Great. And then Joe asked, will the slides be available? And Joe, we will have the slides available along with the recording.